Hello, I am Jason Jeweler with AEP 855, the case study. To summarize our case, Assistant Principal Inman builds a strong relationship with a troubled group of students who is led by James, who has a very troubled past, but he's kind of working around those edges and starting to kind of get on a better path, thanks to Principal Inman. Honor student David, who is very well thought of in the school, and troubled student James are seen making an exchange. The teacher reports that drugs were being exchanged, so both students were then sent to the office. James was already there to discuss his third tardy of the week with Principal Inman. After getting word from this report, Assistant Principal Inman then decided to involve the officer, who then searched the bag of David. A pair of brass knuckles were found in David's bag, which is considered an illegal weapon, which, of course, against the law. In the midst of the officer handcuffing David, James went ahead and spoke up and admitted fault, which Principal Inman was actually very relieved and happy and proud of James for this, just because he kind of knew that this was a step in the right direction for James for taking that responsibility. But then he's also sad knowing that what was about to come for James. Both students were actually arrested, and this kind of shocked Principal Inman because he thought that just because James took fault for what was in the bag of David, or David's bag, he thought David would get off, where that wasn't the case. Both students were taken in. Principal Inman is struggling filing expulsion papers for David because he technically, although the school does have a zero tolerance policy, and so at this point David should also be expelled, but Principal Inman doesn't feel like that's right, and Principal Inman was instructed to file the papers and is in risk of losing his job if he refuses to do so. Some legal issues that are involved with the case. Two students were involved with possession of a lethal weapon at school, or at least both of them were considered to be in possession of. School has a zero tolerance policy in regards to lethal weapons. The principal has a job to do, which is to file the expulsion papers for an honor student, which is something he's very troubled with. The situation did involve an officer, which if you kind of scale back and think, if the principal didn't involve the officer right away, things would definitely be different. The principal only filed papers for one student, which was James, even though both of them were technically at fault because David didn't report that James had forced him to take the weapon. So to synthesize, with his job on the line, Principal Inman has to make the difficult decision whether or not to file expulsion papers for a student he doesn't believe deserves to be expelled, contrary to the school's zero tolerance policy. The facts of this case. The people involved: Assistant Principal Inman, James, who's the troubled student, David, the honor student, the officer, the parents. James' mom was kind of just kind of brushed it off and said, well, leave him. When he was arrested, she said, just leave him there. Maybe he'll finally learn his lesson. Whereas David's mom was absolutely perplexed about the situation, and she didn't handle it well. Just very emotional in the situation. And then also the teacher. Truthfully, I don't know if the teacher necessarily handled it right, because they kind of jumped to conclusion right away. And it could have gone differently for sure. Location: Rocket Junior High. And then programs: the after school program, which is where Principal Inman built that really good relationship with James and his fellow buddies. The school policy is also involved with as the zero tolerance policy. And then the DAEP, which is kind of the disciplinary program involved in, and James has been through it, but both students are going to have to go through it, which will ultimately lead to them being expelled for a certain amount of days. So to kind of prioritize some of the information, James has a troubled past. He's kind of one of those students that you would think about as the bad kid of the school, whereas David is the ideal student, very good in this classroom, also very skilled, plays the trombone, so kind of just someone that's the ideal student. James admits to forcing David to hold the weapon, which David also admits that he was going to use it later in the day. David did not report James and kept possession of a weapon, which is why he was still at fault. Principal Inman immediately involved an officer, which again, although it was kind of a rushed decision, I'm sure there was a lot going through his mind at this point, but it was a rushed kind of mistake almost. Principal Inman was instructed to follow the papers and is expected to follow school policy, and Principal Inman doesn't feel as though it is the right thing to do to expel David. So some options. Obviously, option one, which is the one that, although it's not the easiest thing to do, it's through the school's eyes, it would be the right thing to do, which is to go ahead and file the expulsion papers for David. Option two, do not file expulsion papers for David. And three, attempt to change school policy. As we look at these policy or these options, if we file the expulsion papers for David, the pros, you keep your job. You also set a very clear standard for the students, which is we won't accept any type of bad behavior. And you also please your boss. He was instructed to file those papers, and the boss said, you better do it. And when you just do what your boss says, you keep that person happy, which keeps your job. Cons, to me, in the eyes of, looking at it, if I were a student, knowing the situation, because word's going to get around that, well, David wasn't actually doing anything wrong. He just got caught up in a really bad situation. So you kind of lose the trust of the students because in their eyes, it's David was this great kid and he even got kicked out. So what's he going to do to me? Also, you might ruin the future of a very bright student because this won't look good for David at all. Option two, which is to not file expulsion papers for David. The pros, you did what you thought was best for the student. You're going to keep David in school and possibly do what's best for him. It also clears your conscience because knowing that David just got caught up in a really bad situation and he obviously felt terrible about it, you don't have that conscious or that guilt on your shoulders that, you just expelled a kid that shouldn't be expelled. Also, you keep the trust of students. On the downside, you lose the trust of your boss. You will probably end up losing your job in that process. And it also looks bad in the eye of the community because media can frame this in so many different ways. And especially if they get word that two students were arrested and only one of them was expelled, and it looks bad because they say, well, the kid from the south side of town was expelled, but not the other one. So again, they can really frame this in any which way and make the school look bad, but especially Principal Inman. Option three, which is to attempt to change school policy. Some good things about this. You could avoid disobeying school policy by changing it and changing it for the better. You could ultimately end up keeping your job, and this could also be a great change and something that's probably way past due for the school and the betterment for the students. However, some cons, you could still end up losing your job. When you fight against school policy, it may not look the best in terms of those that are higher. It also just kind of creates a delay in the inevitable, which is if you don't change the policy, if those things don't fall through for that, then ultimately the kid gets expelled and you lose your job, and you just kind of delayed that process. Also, it could create a very negative energy for school policy, whereas now everything that's decided on could be come into question. And how can you allow this one to be changed, but you can't allow this one? So a lot of things kind of up in the air with that one, but ultimately, I would choose option three because I'm going to fight for what I believe is right, as long as I'm acting ethically. I think if I present this and present all of the facts to not only the school board, but the superintendent, all those involved, especially the stakeholders, the community, if I can explain the situation, that I think I can get more people on my side and ultimately end up changing that rule, which, although it could be a lengthy process, I'm going down swinging for what I believe is right. And ultimately, and I think especially in this day and age, we're realizing that the zero tolerance policy is not what's best for students, because you look at a student like David who's caught up in a very bad situation, it's not his fault. Now, you can make the case that the kid has to report and he still has to tell someone, but he's kind of in fear that he's going to get in trouble no matter what. So he kind of fell on a double-edged sword. So I think that is best what's best for all students. Again, you go down fighting for what you believe is right, and you're not acting unethical, because you're not necessarily saying, look, you could go on the other side of that. You fight for it. They don't change school policy. And then maybe you say, okay, I'll go ahead and file the papers. But you at least went down swinging, and maybe you can make amends with David in the end. But how I would implement, so going with option 3, if I were to then be able to get the policy changed, we'd go away with the zero tolerance policy. We would implement the ability to launch a full investigation with any situation or scenario that comes up. Also incorporate a team that would review the case and vote to make a decision. I don't want to be the only one in this deciding factor, because not only would that limit what could be the possible right decision, but I think ultimately having a group of people that can come together, and you can kind of go different directions with this. You can incorporate somebody from the community, a parent, and another teacher, you, a superintendent. You can get quite a few people involved with this, but I think the more that you kind of, and you don't want to have a crazy big group, but a group of people you trust and value their opinion, you get together and you'd be able to make those type of decisions, then I think in the end, yeah, the best decision would be made. Also, in the end, you want to act in the student's best interest. It's not in David's best interest to be kicked out of school. And in fact, James's best interest is to continue the after school program and being able to work with Principal Inman. Also provide a strike system. Look, this was David's first strike. And although James has kind of been through quite a few, David's never had so much as a mark on his record. So I think if you kind of go down the system of a strike system, which would then eventually lead into a reinstatement procedure where, James has had so many troubles. Well, give him the opportunity to show that he can come back better and not cause problems. But also for David, maybe you kind of put him on a well, you've got one strike against you, make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think doing that would just not only kind of take away that zero tolerance policy, which has a very negative connotation these days, but also ultimately, again, do what's best for the students, which is our number one goal when it comes to education and being that building leader that we all need. Thank you for taking the time to listen. Hope you enjoyed.